It's 1972. American Pie by Don McLean is in the charts. Pong becomes the first commercially successful computer game. And Fiat launched the 126. It was known as the Flea in Slovenia, as the Bambino in Germany, Little Rooster in Albania, but most famously as the Maluch, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, but let me know if I'm not, in Poland. This one is a later 126 BIS model which was made by FSM in 1988. LJK Searchright once said that the appeal of the BIS was that it gave you a compulsive need to drive it absolutely flat out all the time and everywhere. I'm going to find out if that's true, but first I'm going to tell you about a bit of a history of this car and a couple of really surprising facts as well. Between 1989 and 1992, this was actually sold in Australia. It was then that country's cheapest car. In the 80s, this was one of the best-selling cars in China, at one point selling a massive 30,000 units per year. The 500 was much loved, but after 15 years, Fiat knew that they had to replace it. They didn't move that far from the original concept though, because the wheelbase on this is exactly the same. The layout is the same, and the original ones that came out in 72 used a 600cc engine, which was also in the later Fiat 500s. It did though have some upgrades. The first, obviously, is the all-new body. It wasn't as pretty as the 500, but it brought it up to date with Fiat's most recent designs, and it also allowed more usability by adding room. They moved the starter motor from the rear of the engine to the side so that they could move the rear seats back another 10 centimetres. Also in 1975 the engine went up from 600 to 700 cc's. It was also made under licence by FSM in Poland, and in that country it was the most popular car in the 80s. Let's take it out though, I'll tell you how it drives and tell you a little bit more about this particular evolution of the 126, about the BIS. Now many people see the external size of these things and think they must be so uncomfortable, they must be so slow. But really, you can see, I fit in it just fine. The only area where there's lacking in room, I suppose, is your elbow on the right-hand side, close to the door. Otherwise, it's really perfectly comfortable. Even the seats are great. The 126 BIS is a very interesting car. It's a bit of an anomaly really, because the original air-cooled cars, having the engine in the back, they had no hatchback. The room is actually in the front if you needed to carry any stuff with you, also known as the frunk in 911 circles. So when they made this car, you'd think, well, they made a water-cooled version. It was also 700cc, so it'll be because they wanted a bit more speed. They wanted it to be quicker. Power went up from 23 to 26 horsepower with the new engine, but it's not really, it doesn't feel any faster, and it sounds quite similar. It's maybe a little bit quieter. The main reason that I can think of why they did this is that having the horizontal water-cooled parallel twin enabled them to make this into a hatchback, and therefore much more practical. Even then, this little car was only made for 4 years, from 87 to 91. The air-cooled versions was much more of a success, and was made all the way to the year 2000. If you take the launch date of the original 500, which is 1957, to the year 2000, this is one of the longest running designs ever. The engine and the hatchback weren't the only changes that were made. It got a new steering rack. It also got bigger wheels that went up from 12 inches to a massive 13 inch with, I think, slightly lower profile tyres. The biggest change for me though is the gearbox. This is all synchro apart from first gear. makes a massive difference. You really have to double declutch and blip the throttle on a 500 to get smooth changes. This makes it much, much easier. It's still a bit of a challenge to keep up with traffic, but it's definitely better than a 500 would be. So the time has come to take it through the gears. Let's see how it fares. So I'm up to 50 miles an hour here, which is 10 below the speed limit. And yeah, I mean, it is unbelievably slow, but I can see what Searchright meant when he said that these make you want to drive absolutely flat out everywhere. You're so within your limits all the time that the fun is in just making the most of it and just really, you know, getting the most that you can out of the car. Now, the original Fiat 500 was also a very unsafe car. This one, the 126, not just the BIS, the 126 in general, had added safety from Fiat. 15 years later, what did they do? They put in a collapsible steering column. The fuel tank was better enclosed. And also, let's not forget, this was the first one to introduce dual circuit brakes. So if one of them went, if the back went, you had a chance that some of them, the front brakes, would still be working. It's incredible when you think that the 126 outlived the car that was released by Fiat to replace it. So in 1989, the new Fiat 500 came out, which was a completely different design. But that only lived, actually it came out in 91, and that only lived until 96. This was made up until the year 2000. Not the water-cooled version, but the air-cooled version lived up until then. There were various improvements, inverted commas, and facelifts. So this one, the BIS, has quite a few bits from the 500 on the interior, the steering wheel, the dash, so it doesn't look quite as old as the previous cars. I'm quite impressed. I know 500 well, and I'm quite impressed with how much more of a modern car this is. Yes, it still has the essence. The sound is very familiar, although a little bit subdued. It's a little bit easier to drive. It's got a little bit more power. It's not quite as slow, but it also rides better. I'm not sure what they did to the suspension. But overall, there's more space. The interior with the carpet is nicer. This one, normally it would have come with cloth. It was at some point redone with these sort of leatherette seats. It's nice. The red with the white interior does look, sorry, the red interior with the white exterior does look nice. So the quieter engine and all these mods do make it a very refined car compared to a horse car. Well, no, compared to the ones that came before, this is much more refined. It still has the limitations of having such a small engine, but overall, it's probably the most comfortable I've ever been in a 126 or a Fiat 500. Let's squeeze that little engine one last time as we head back. I'll tell you a little bit more about the handling as well. Now these, keep forgetting, first isn't synchro, so even very slow speeds, it doesn't quite crunch, but you've got to remember that. 30, 35, 40. Oh, let's talk about a little bit about the handling, because that's part, I think, of what has led to a renaissance in 126s. You used to be able to get them for next to nothing. But I think time, the fact that it's different from the 500, which is a bit obvious in some ways, has meant that these are now much more appreciated. And there's some videos that have come from Poland of these things in rallies being absolutely chucked all over the place. So all in all, they are now much more popular. They're still not as loved as a 500, but they have found their own niche. Tom Hanks was famously gifted one from a village in Poland, I think, where they were made because he loved them so much. They are different to the famous 500s, but they have their own specific appeal. And it's really not bad to drive. The steering does feel better than on a 500, and it still retains that charm and the fun that those had. Plus the fact that you can squeeze every last inch of performance from it. Even though it's so slow, you're not going to get bored in it. Now, believe it or not, Martin, who owns this is their dog wagon. Now, they currently have 3 dash hounds, so I can think that would be okay, but they used to have 3 Labradors, and this was their car for the Labradors, and Martin says it was always absolutely perfect. Now, the engine may be low on power, but you can work around it, you can get used to it. What is a bit more difficult to live with are the brakes. They are drums all round, and they are difficult to get to grips with. It's got a very mushy pedal, and even when you press it all the way down, there's zero feel, and it doesn't really particularly want to stop. So it's a good job that the engine doesn't have more power than it does. A few years back, I went to Italy and I bought a 1972 Fiat 500L. I drove it all the way back to the UK. Have a look at that video if you haven't seen it yet, because it was an incredible adventure from my earlier YouTube days. Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you to Martin for bringing it down, and see you for the next video.